and welcome to Economics Matters. Today, we are joined with Martin Wolf, a guest I'm very excited about. And we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of things today, including economics and politics and society in general. My name is Alex Kotlikoff. I'm a co-producer of the show, and I'll hand it off here to Larry to give more of an introduction to Martin.
Thanks, Alex. I want to welcome Martin. Martin is a young friend for a long time. I don't want to call you an old friend because you're not in any way old. You're looking younger every time I meet you, and you're certainly, just starting out your career from my perspective. But let me just say, you've had a long career up to this point. You're the chief economist. I just want to read a short bio about Martin so everybody knows everything about you up till now. You're the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times. So Martin's the chief economics correspondent, is the term we would use more in the U.S. for the Financial Times. And everybody knows the Financial Times is like the world's leading economics publication, daily newspaper. Martin was awarded the Commander of the British Empire, CBE, medal designation in 2000. That's not a trivial thing. I guess it came from the Queen. You're a member of the UK government's Independent Commission on Banking. You were a member between 2010 and 2011, September 2011, looking at the financial crisis and how to reform banking in the UK. Martin's an honorary fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford, and King's College, London. He has an honorary doctorate from 6 universities, including the London School of Economics, LSE. He is a University Global Fellow of Columbia University. He won the Ludwig Erhard Prize for Economic Commentary in 2009, the 33rd Asia International Journalism Prize in 2012, the Overseas Press Club of America's Prize for Best Commentary on International News in Any Medium in 2013. And in 2019, he got the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Gerald Globe Awards. His most recent book is The Shifts and Shocks, What We Learned Have Still to Learn from the Financial Crisis. But guess what? There's another book coming along. It's called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. It's due out February 7th, 2023. You can pre-order it now on Amazon or your local bookstore. And Martin, we're delighted to have you here. We have a bunch of questions we've kind of come up with, but you're free to take this in any direction you'd like. This is Economics Matters, the podcast. And, one of the things we're trying to do is talk to people in different areas about the global economy, their national economies, regional economies, also about personal finance, also about their careers. And so we're having a whole range of people. Right after you, we're going to have Sebastian Malaby talk about the Ukraine, but we want to get your views on that too. But I want to start by asking you, and then Alex is going to jump in here. So we're going to hit you from both sides. How did Martin Wolf become Martin Wolf? Give us that quick history.
Well, you presumably want the 1 minute answer and not the 1 hour answer. So the answer, there are, I think, 3 or 4 major elements which explain me, which are really important. The first is who my parents were, really important. My parents were both Jewish refugees from Hitler. My father came from Vienna in 1937 to England, and my mother escaped from the Netherlands, Holland, as the Germans were invading in May 1940. They met here. Their immediate family survived the war, but all their wider families, and we're talking about 45 people, were murdered. And that shaped me in very important ways, that the sense of fragility that comes from that. shaped me in very important ways. My father was an intellectual, a writer, very classic Central European, and that influenced me. Second, I went to Oxford, where I studied classics, Latin and Greek, and then politics, philosophy, and economics, and then economics as a graduate. So I have quite a broad humanistic sort of educational background, non-technical, non-mathematical, if you like, cultural and historical. It was a very different perspective, I think, from most economists. I never wanted to be an academic. I was reasonably confident that I would make it, but I would be sort of make it second rate, as it were. And I had no real interest in doing something that I thought I would be second rate at. And so I went first off to the World Bank. That's the third big thing in my life. My very first job was at the World Bank. And the reason I did this is because I thought, this is back in the early 70s, that development was one of the greatest challenges in our world, and for economists particularly. And I wanted to do something which I thought was practical, which would make a difference. And I learned immensely large amount of things at the World Bank, but I got pretty frustrated with it as an institution. I've written about this. I left to join a think tank which focused on trade, international trade, which is a passion of mine, trade and development particularly. And then finally, and this is the last sort of final stage of my career, that folded and I needed to decide what to do next. And that was really up for grabs. I really didn't know. I was in my early 40s. So it's now 35 years ago, and completely out of the blue, utterly out of the blue. The editor of the Financial Times came along and said, you write very nice letters, and I've written some guest articles for them too. And he said, you'll be a great journalist. Go and try. And I thought, that sounds like fun. Irresponsible fun. I can write what I like. So that's what I did.
So you've been at the FT for 35 years now.
I've been there since 1987.
Wow, fantastic! And writing more and more interesting. Everything's interesting. You're writing, so I encourage everybody to go to theft.com, get a subscription, and cool. So let's start by Alex. You want to hit Martin up with our first query here?
I guess the big, this might be the most expensive question, but I guess we want to get your sense of what the global economic outlook is for the future here. I just read your most recent article about Jerome Powell's comments regarding raising interest rates and inflation. I don't know whether my sense is that you don't come down either way on this, but you did a great job of exploring both sides of the risks. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and what your sense is for the future.
Well, I think we have to distinguish, as always in these things, or the way I think about it, over different time horizons. So my big picture, we can come back to this, is we are in a decade in which some really quite profound changes in the global political and economic orders are occurring within economies and very much among them. And this is a period correspondingly of very high uncertainty about the future. And in my lifetime, I suppose the decade which seems to me to be most like that, in this sense of we didn't know where it would end up, was the 70s, which was the beginning of my professional career. Although I think in some ways this is even more complicated because it includes the emergence of a major new superpower conflict with a new superpower, and how that will go is more profoundly uncertain. So in a way, it's a bit like the late 40s with the beginning of the Cold War and the 70s. So that's the longer term. The second point is sort of immediate, the past. In the last 15 years, we've had three major global economic shocks: the global financial crisis, obviously, then the COVID shock, and now the energy crisis associated particularly with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, though it started before that. And that's what makes it feel a bit like the 70s, but even more so. Um, and these shocks keep on coming, and we don't have a sense of how they will play out. And then finally, in the the really quite short run, one of the consequences, it seems to me, of these shocks is that we've suddenly jumped into a high inflation regime. And after a very long period where we got completely used to 2% inflation or less, and all the central banks were worried, how do we get inflation up to our targets? Now they're suddenly worried about, well, how do we get them down? And this is significant in the US, but in Europe, of course, because of the energy price shock, we're talking about inflation rates in the upper teens, quite possibly. So that's a new environment. Now, how is this all going to play out? I think it's going to be seriously messy. I expect inflation to fall. I'll just focus on this. It will fall partly because a lot of these shocks are by their nature temporary, and they will pass through. And they will also fall because I think as a result of the shocks themselves and of the central bank's response to them, we're going to go into recessions in the developed countries, particularly in Europe, but I expect it also in America. I may be wrong. And I expect that to drive down underlying inflation. But it's going to take a while to get there. And the result will be a period of considerable uncertainty for macroeconomics, the labor market, and I think financial markets.
Do you think the Fed and probably other central bankers are overreacting? If this is supply side temporary shocks, we're seeing the price of oil is now below where it was back in February when the invasion happened. Same thing for the price of wheat, even though Ukraine is a major provider of wheat. The world supply system capitalism has come to the rescue here. And I think Germany reported that only 10% of its natural gas is coming from Russia anymore, at least last month, and that they've started to find substitutes. We did a podcast with Eitan Chashinsky, who you may know from one of the very prominent Israeli economists, Yuval Steinitz, who's a former finance minister, a member of parliament. We're talking about the Israeli gas find, and they suggested that by shipping gas from the Israeli fields to Egypt and having the gas refined there and sent, by tanker to Europe, they could supply 10% of European needs. So that's like an unexpected source, but there are probably a lot of these unexpected sources that are coming on board. So do you think I know there's lots of pressure by people like Larry Summers in the U.S. that the Fed should kill the economy in order to save the economy. I think killing the economy, personally, I think that would be an overreaction, raising interest rates just to deal with temporary price increases that will come down. But anyway, what's your view?
Well, my view is probably somewhere in between you. I tend to go for the golden mean. But anyway, my perception is that there are some of the price increase will be permanent, certainly in Europe, even in the model you described, when semi-permanent would be a better way of describing it. We can, of course, replace gas at a price, but it's going to take quite a bit of time to replace all the gas that we were getting from Russia. The new sources will be more expensive, and the guess is, from what I'm reading, we're talking about a year or two, possibly longer, maybe 3, before it's fully made up. In that situation, gas, which is the basic source not just of heating but also of electricity generation, will remain expensive, and that will be it's a terms of tariff shock, and it's also a real income shock for people. And in this respect, I think it's very similar to, as I said, with what happened in the 70s and early 80s. And this is at a time when, in most of our economies, and it's certainly true in the US, where I think this is a more important issue, the labor market is very, very strong. Vacancies are high. Nominal wages have been rising somewhat above steady state levels. So I think it is perfectly reasonable for the central banks to say, in this context, we don't want a second round of wage inflation, which will follow these price rises as all the workers try to restore their real incomes, because the real income shock is very large. And so some weakening of the labor market is going to be needed. I would also add that I don't regard the policies. Now, this is, of course, where it gets really complicated. But I don't regard the monetary policies they're pursuing as in any way tight. My view is rather different. Essentially, and that was the view I've expressed now for quite a long time, during 2020, particularly March, they adopted pretty well the most stimulative monetary policies ever. By 2021, it was obvious the economy was returning to normal quicker than we expected, and two, that we were getting into quite a lot of supply shocks. I think it was sensible then to think about normalizing monetary policy to more reasonable nominal and real rates, particularly real rates. The real short-term rate of interest in every one of our economies is currently massively negative. That doesn't seem to me a very contractionary monetary policy. Far from it. I think it's still a very expansionary monetary policy. Now, we can argue in a sort of detail, well, does that count when you've got these sort of real income shocks? That's a very good question. But I don't think that the normalization of monetary policy that has been going on, including just beginning now in Europe, is unreasonable in this context. Finally, could they get it wrong? Of course they could get it wrong. It would be incredibly easy to get it wrong. This is the sort of situation which people do. I suppose I'm very influenced by my 70s experience that what we really don't want to do is destabilize expectations seriously. So if they're somewhat too tight, I think they will adjust to that, and I can live with it.
Okay. Well, I mean, I agree that, and I've written that the Fed hasn't been fighting inflation; it's been accommodating because of these interest rate increases haven't really raised short-term real rates. If anything, they've gone down during this time where the Fed has been making some increases. And but then, as you said, because of these real supply side shocks, if you take away a big supplier to the world economy, you'd expect real incomes to go down, but they have gone down already. In the U.S., real wages have dropped like 3%. So I don't quite see that the Fed needs to do anything to get the real adjustment. You're worried, of course, that the workers are going to come back and demand much higher salaries, but I don't know. I mean, I see in academia, in my university, we've got a 9% inflation running this country, and wage increases are 3%. So I'm expecting a 6%.
It's not what's happening here, and it's not what I'm seeing in the broad US statistics. I think that this second round process is worrying, maybe least in the US. I don't know. I can tell you that in the UK, we are having strikes in basically every service you can mention. And that's exactly, again, what happened in the 70s. But these are matters of judgment. And I think if it's obvious that we're moving into recession, and it's quite possible for all the reasons we've discussed, then I would expect the central banks to adjust. And I expect them to make mistakes because nobody's going to do this perfectly.
What has been the wage increase since 2020 in the UK and the rest of Europe right now?
Well, obviously in 2020, it was very, very low for obvious reasons. So it's partly catch up. I think recently it's been running about 5%, if I remember correctly. 4 to 5%. Given that we have next to no productivity growth, that means unit labor costs are rising about 3 or 4%, and that's way above the 2% inflation target. In the UK case, by the way, and this is an important point, this is what makes it so difficult. The real income effects are not just internal distribution from the rise in the price of energy. They're a massive external tax. We've got a huge terms of trade loss, and that means that aggregate real demand in the British economy is going to shrink substantially. And that is a reason why I think the Europeans, including the British, central bank have to be much more careful about tightening monetary policy than in the US, where, of course, the net effect of higher energy prices in aggregate in the economy is essentially zero.
Why are the energy prices? It seems like from what I'm reading, gas prices are going up much more rapidly than in the U.S. I mean, gasoline, for example, is less than $4 a gallon for regular gas in the U.S. When it was up to, I think, $6 a few months back. But you're seeing the opposite, right? In the UK.
I haven't looked at, because we haven't really been focusing on what we would call petrol prices. You call gasoline prices to separate, or gas prices to separate from our gas prices, which creates a lot of confusion. Of course, in our petrol prices, taxes are an enormously much bigger wedge than they are in the US. So they're always very expensive. But the effect, we've not been very concerned about what's been happening to petrol prices. Oil prices rises are really relatively trivial. The big problem is gas and the impact of that on electricity prices, because it's the main generating fuel. There, the price rises are in the neighborhood since January of 11 or 12 times. And that means, to take the obvious, let me give you the indication, because I've been working on it. The average cost for electricity and gas of a British household in the last year roughly would have been about, so this is for an average household, about £1,000 a year, which is what, $1,200 or $1,300. And it is now expected that next year this will be over 6,000. So, and at that level, the cost of energy to an average household will be about a fifth of energy to run the house will be about a fifth of income. So this is the biggest crisis. It's not now. Obviously, that's going to be contractionary, though I think that will reduce dramatically the need to worry about inflation, monetary policy. But of course, it's a simply stupendous tax, and a very significant part of that, it varies across countries, going abroad. Quite a lot of it is going to indirectly to Mr. Putin. So I think we are mostly focusing now on the implications of this absolutely enormous shift in the price of gas and the corresponding increase in the price of electricity.
So it seems like it's going up a whole lot. Well, I mean, the U.S. has got our shale. We have different sources of gas, but the UK has the North Sea. Why is it that the UK's gas prices are going up so dramatically compared to, I think, Central Europe and the US, from what I gather? Maybe I've got that wrong, but
no, our rises in prices of gas are basically the same as in the rest of Europe. It's an integrated market. It's basically the same. In our case, North Sea gas production has fallen dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. Basically, we've used up the fuel. It's there, and there may now be new investment which will generate more gas. But at the moment, we're very, very large net importers. And because this is an integrated market within Europe, our prices of gas inevitably go up with the prices of gas everywhere else in Europe. As I said, essentially integrated. Even though we import most of our gas from Norway, the price at which we pay then basically becomes equalized with the price of the gas in Germany or in Italy. But the point about gas as opposed to oil is it's essentially in the short run it's a semi-tradable. In the long run it's clearly a tradable, but in the short run it's a semi-tradable because it's a fixed system, fixed infrastructure, pipelines essentially. It doesn't moving liquid gas around is much more complicated than moving liquid petroleum and oil about, for the very obvious reasons that it will tend to evaporate into gas if not under pressure. So keeping that up is very difficult. And we simply don't have the systems in place now to move vast quantities of compressed gas, liquid gas, into Europe and around it. Now that will change over the next 2 or 3 years, and this problem will be solved, and we will become independent of Russia. But it will take adjustment and investment of that sort of period before we're through it.
Alex, let's talk to Martin about Ukraine.
Well, I guess the question is, if there was a peace treaty tomorrow, would that even be necessary? Not that I think that the prospects for that are good, but what is your sense of how this will end up? Where are we going? Is there a settlement that could be agreed upon that is reasonable for both sides and is something that is in the realm of possibility, or is this going to be an indefinite war?
Well, I'm not a foreign relations expert, but obviously I've thought about this because it's such a big factor for the European economy, indeed the world economy. And to come back to my theme at the beginning, we really don't know. You can imagine at one extreme end that Putin is essentially defeated on the battlefield, so that the weaponry coming into Ukraine over time and means that Ukraine will start pushing him back. And then the question is, will he accept that defeat or does he go nuclear? And there are lots of people who think that he will go nuclear in one way or another. Lots of people. So that's one end of this. Ukraine wins or Putin escalates because he simply cannot accept defeat. At the other end, Russia finally overwhelms them by building up more and more resources, mass mobilization, all the rest of it. And because it's 4 times as large, roughly, in the end, it wins, and we're not going to be involved in it directly. And in that case, that's going to be a Russian victory. Both of these options, I think, take time, given where we are. And neither seems incredibly likely, as far as I can see. So the most likely outcome is I think that the front stabilizes roughly where it is. It seems to be freezing in that way. Neither side has the capacity to win. Neither side will accept the current situation as the legitimate outcome of the war, the acceptable outcome of the war. And then you either have a frozen conflict without a formal ceasefire, or actually a ceasefire without a peace treaty, which is what we've had in Korea for 70 years, right? A ceasefire without a peace treaty. Both of those are, I think, either of those are possible, though I think the frozen conflict is more likely of the two. So essentially it isn't resolved. And then, of course, there's the final possibility that's too pessimistic. And suddenly somebody says, well, let's actually have peace. I can't see this happening with the current regimes. Putin needs a victory, and Zelensky will certainly not think that he can end the war without, at the very least, getting back the eastern provinces. And he talks about getting back Crimea, which the Russians will never concede now. So this is one of those situations, and this is important. Whether or not you think there was a settlement before the war, and there's tremendous amount of debate about whether there was the possibility of a settlement before the war, the Minsk Treaty and so forth, whether that could have been the basis. By now, both sides has lost a vast amount in blood and treasure. And once you're in a war in which you've lost vast amounts of blood and treasure, you have to sort of justify this to your people. And you can't justify it by clearly failing to reach your minimum aims. And in Putin's aim, it was essentially to stop Ukraine becoming a viable westernized state. And in Ukraine's case, is to get back the unity of their country and, if possible, compensation for the damage. So I simply don't see how a peace treaty emerges. I think we're sort of in the situation we were in the middle of the First World War, when whatever people might have wanted in 1914, by 1916, too much blood and treasure had been lost for anybody to accept a peace until one side collapsed. And that happened in the end for various reasons, but it does not seem very likely now.
So let me just play or suggest something off the wall here, which is, what if if NATO were to bring Ukraine into the group and immediately declare a ceasefire and tell Russia, look, if you violate the ceasefire, you're going to be actually at war with NATO. But otherwise, you can keep everything you've got. You can declare it part of Russia if you want, you keep the Crimea, but you cannot attack any more of Ukraine. The war is over. You can declare victory. Ukraine can declare a victory. They would have lost something, but they would have gained security, indefinite security. And that seems to me to be a win-win for both sides. It's an extreme idea, but you could certainly negotiate this quietly with Russia in advance and see if it could work out. What do you think of that?
Well, there are a number of wild options, as it were, wilder options. I think that this will be feasible. It could be discussed. There are two main obstacles, pretty obvious, very, very big. Three very big obstacles. First, the NATO countries would have to commit themselves to defending rump Ukraine. And that means they would have to be prepared to go to war with Russia. And the Americans, and who will be the principal players in this, at least under the present administration, have made it very, very, very clear that they regard having an actual shooting war with Russia, which after all does have 4,000 nuclear warheads, as an option not to be taken lightly. So I don't know whether the Americans and the other NATO members would accept. Second, for Zelensky, it would give him security, and he would like that, but it does mean accepting the truncation of his country and losing now really important bits of the country, not just Crimea in the east, but Kherson and so forth. So this is sort of a big defeat, and we do have to discuss how it's built up again. And then finally, for Putin, it means telling his people, that we went in to stop the fascists from uniting with the West and posing a threat to Russia. And what we've now accepted is that the bulk of Ukraine will survive, and NATO will be on that bit substantially closer, which means American troops, essentially substantially closer to our Russian frontiers. So all three sides would have to swallow a lot to do this. I'm not against trying things like this. I have friends who are suggesting things like that, but I do think that options that might have been easier, for instance, possibly earlier, they are very, very difficult. And I don't think anyone has the imagination to take the risks that you describe. But I wouldn't be unhappy if I'm wrong.
I I think just jumping off from this point a little bit, we've been talking about how essentially this war has created an enormous gas tax for the rest of the world, but particularly the West. If the U.S., if Europe plunges into a recession, but particularly the U.S., what is that going to mean politically? It seems to be like a massive boon for Trump and the GOP. You've written recently about the sort of the Trump wing of the Republican Party's victory over Liz Cheney and what that means for the party as a whole. What it means in terms of the GOP's aims for political power. Do you think that we're going in a direction where Trump and the GOP will reclaim power? And in that case, what do you think? What do you envision will happen?
Well, I think about this a lot, and if I were confident that continuing with the sort of monetary policies we had 15 months ago, with those sorts of interest rates, would produce outcomes which would prevent it, I would be certainly prepared to consider it. I'm not persuaded that it would. I think it would increase the chances that, and I may be completely wrong, I accept this, that inflation would run out of control. So I think the macro policy makers, as it were, are in sort of between a rock and a hard place right now. And of course, there's inflationary dynamics for reasons we've discussed, which are going to be present at least through the midterms. My reading, and you are much closer to this, of course, than I am, is that the Democratic side are a bit more optimistic about the midterms than they were a few months ago for various reasons, including the impact of the Roe versus Wade repeal, at least the way in which the FBI raid on Trump, the reaction of him and his party seems to make them look even more lawless than before. That it is possible, people seem to hope, that, as it were, the independents, the middle, are getting more anxious, and they're not going to vote, therefore, just on the immediate economics. I don't know whether any of that is true. No idea. But I am convinced, as you know, that over the last, well, at least 8 years or so, I think it goes back further, the Republican Party has been transformed from being a normal democratic political party with strong political programs, strong views, into an organization which no longer hews to standard democratic norms and no longer accepts the normal principles of the rule of law, and has been assailing absolutely core institutions, of which the most important, I think, are the electoral process itself and acceptance of the outcome of the electoral process, and the institutions of the law. I have to tell you that, having lived in America for 10 years back in the 70s, it never occurred to me that somebody would accuse the FBI of being a semi-communist institution. That was not the way we thought about it, to put it mildly, until recently. So I feel they've gone off the reservation. They've become more like Viktor Orban's party or Mr. Erdogan's party. So that, given that, and given the program that we know they are developing, I am very concerned that if they get back into power, that is to say, they control Congress and the presidency, that they will behave in ways that fundamentally distort and possibly permanently or semi-permanently the working of the American democratic system, which is the American Republican system. And I'm also concerned that in this situation, the courts, and particularly the Supreme Court, will not oppose them. So I am very, very anxious about this. And this is not just because I'm concerned about America. I wrote a column in March 2016, which I think is maybe the best column on this sort of subject I've ever written, which was when, before Donald Trump even became the candidate, and the headline of this was Donald Trump is how great republics meet their end. And I discussed the implication of such a figure for the survival of republics, core Republican institutions. And I think that was a relevant analysis, and subsequent developments seem to make this clearer. So I am very concerned. This would not only be, of course, vast significance for the US, that's obvious. It will be vast significance for the world. Democracy is somewhat beleaguered now. There's been a radical shift against democratic institutions across much of the world, increasing doubt about it, not just throughout the developing and emerging world, but also even in Europe. We are, to take just an example, we are expecting a center-right government in Italy shortly, in which the prime minister will be the head of a neo-fascist party. It's quite simply the party that was descended from Mussolini's party. We see in France, most recently, that essentially the centrist president, whether you like him or not, can no longer have a majority in parliament. The extreme left and right, and I mean really extreme left and right, is dominant there. I could go many other examples. If the United States goes in this way, which was the bulwark of democracy in the 20th century, then I worry for the future of democracy. And I am a passionate believer in democracy as a system. I think it is essential. It is a core part of preserving our freedoms. I mean liberal democracy. I mean democracy which is entrenched in law, what you would call a republic, a democratic republic. So I am very concerned about the future. That's why I've written this book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And I don't want the systems like China's or Russia's or even Turkey's to become dominant in the world. I think that will be horrible.
Well, we agree with you. I mean, we're also equally nervous and upset. And do you want to expand a little bit more on your book? Anything beyond that for a teaser? I mean, it's a pretty good teaser.
Well, yes, I will, because I think it's where, in a way, I can be most challenged, and I'd be quite interested in your reaction. Broadly speaking, the theme of this book is this. Over the last 200 years or so, I mean, my story starts with the agricultural revolution, agrarian revolution 10,000 years ago. It's a big, sweeping thing. We developed a capitalist economy, a market, I call it market capitalism, which was a revolutionary development in human society, human history. And out of that, and I argue in quite some depth why it came out of that, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, we developed, it started really in a way in the US with the 18th century, but really in the 19th, increased acceptance of a transformation of politics as well. Instead of having a system essentially based on the idea that those with power also enjoy all the wealth, and those with the wealth enjoy all the power, which was the essential characteristic of pre-modern politics, we developed these extraordinary systems in which our political systems and our economic systems were both what I call complementary opposites. That is to say, democracy needs capitalism and capitalism needs democracy, but they also involve a tension because in capitalism, of course, you do develop enormous concentrations, quite inevitable, of wealth, which could potentially be power. But in the political system, at least in theory, and to some extent in reality, distributes power across the public at large, across the entire people. That is the basic assumption of democracy. And this is a fascinating, complex, in my view, very fertile system. But it's a fragile one. And I think the core of the book, is that this system has become fragile in large part, not in only, there are many other things, because in large parts of our population, sizable parts of our population, have come to feel that the system that they live in is rigged against them economically and also politically. So they've come to resent our double elites. We have the double elite, I mean, our plutocratic elite, if you like, libertarian plutocratic elite, and our academic elite, which is liberal, educated, and so forth. What I, following actually Thomas Piketty, call the Brahmin elite. And the creation of this deep dissatisfaction with the two elites has opened up the possibility of authoritarian populism as a major political force. We're seeing that on both the right and the left, but the right, for reasons I won't be able to go into now, has had the better tunes. But of course, you're seeing similar things happening on the left, and the middle is being hollowed out. And I have a wonderful quote, and this is the last thing in this, from Aristotle, because I was a classicist, and it's a wonderful quote in which he says, he did the first political science study in the history of the world, when he did the politics, he sent people around Greece to look at all the city-states and work out which of them had stable democratic constitutions. And he concluded from this, we don't have the evidence for it, but he reports this, that the ones that did so, the ones which had strong middle classes, strong independent middle classes, around which a democratic political system could operate, because they could resist the domination of the oligarchs, the aristocrats, on the one hand, but they were sufficiently independent that they also resisted the appeal of the demagogues on the other. I think that's the case. We need, if you want to combine capitalism with a liberal democracy, as I do, you need to think about what creates and sustains a strong, vigorous, independent middle class. And that's a core part of my book. So that is a very brief summary of the main themes of my book.
Very, very interesting. Well,
I hope you'll read it and tell me where you agree and disagree.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Just thinking, what's kind of courting out the middle class in the U.S. There's certainly automation. There's concentration of kind of economies of scale.
Yes.
You think about Google, you can't have necessarily 3 search engines. Everybody's networking.
That's right.
Facebook.
Trade has played a role. The very beneficial move of capital to emerging and developing countries, that obviously played a role. I think the nature and behavior, I think we would agree on this, the way financial markets have operated. You and I think converge very much on the behavior of banking. And I think this has allowed the emergence of extremely predatory financial behavior. I think severe distortions in our tax systems to favor the oligarchs. I think of things like the tax deductibility of interest and all that. There are many aspects of this, but I think we've created a system which is genuinely rigged in the economics respect, and some of it's natural and inevitable, as Barry points out. And then we have created a completely, and this is, I think, something I didn't realize, I hadn't thought about before, but and it's not enough in my book, but moving from a world in which, say, 5 or 10% of the population went to college, to a world in which there are 40 or 50% created a wholly new class interest, if you like, the clerisy. So Schumpeter talked about that. But it's exploded in size. So the old middle class has been battered and reduced very much in weight. And it's become pretty desperate. And I think the culture wars have, to some degree, come out of that. It's a symptom, not a cause. That's a part of my theme. And I think Trump is a genius, as other such populists are, at exploiting the anxieties, neuroses, and so forth associated with these enormous shifts, which, and to mine, I've written this book because I realize now I didn't understand what was going on. I was far too complacent about what was going on. And it's just been since the financial crisis that I began to realize that, the underpinnings of our society, our political system, have been breaking. Now, of course, we need to deal with the symptom. Trump is a symptom, of course, and an aggravating symptom of the highest degree. But I think we have to also consider the causes.
I have a last question because we have to end soon. But I guess in discussions of the GOP and Trumpism in America and what its aims are, I don't hear a lot in terms of what the sort of who benefits economically under a regime of Trump loyalists and a government that's basically essentially a one-party state, maybe with the fig leaf of constitutionalism. In Germany during Weimar, leading up to the Nazis, as you know, there were some very prominent industrialists that were funding and supporting Hitler. Similar phenomenon happened in Italy. Do you see that? Do you think that there are what does it mean for an economy like ours to shift into an authoritarianism like you're suggesting? Who wins and who loses?
I think that's a wonderful question. So, the 3 minutes left, this is the way I see it in the US case. Clearly, there are very important plutocrats in the US who fund both the Republican Party and Trump, and I know some of them, and I'm sure you do. And this is the way I see their dilemma. Then. Let's assume you are somebody whose main aim is to have a minimum state. Very, very low taxes, very little regulation, all the rest. So you want this very badly. This is your aim. And you've got a democratic political system. Well, it's really, really, really hard to win elections on that basis because, as Larry's been pointing out in different ways, there are very, very large, the majority are on the other side of this because they want to take quite, in my view, perfectly reasonably, but I think you might disagree, but in my view, some part of your gains, probably quite a lot of your gains, and then you get FDR and other horrors. So the way you have to win is creating an alliance with a significant part of the population that are not like you, okay, but can share some things that you share. And the most perfectly evolved system of this kind, I think, in Western history is the southern states of the United States, which I've called the Southern Strategy, which is essentially an extreme plutocracy, the plantocracy, allied with the predominantly poor whites around the theme, cultural and other themes, which emphasize their profound cultural and social division from poor blacks. If you can do that, you've got a majority on your side. And that, I think, was the essential Nixon Southern strategy as its political core. And it was a response, of course, to civil rights, which gave them the opportunity. And it shifted the South, crucially, into the Republican camp. That's what happened. Now, this is then the coalition you formed. Now, for a very long time, respectable Republicans with respectable views, as it were, middle road people, ran this because actually it was doing reasonably well for everybody. So you could still focus on the economics. The cultural element was there, but it wasn't central. It wasn't core. It was there, it was part of it. Of course, we all know that, but it wasn't core. Then, of course, you get hit by a long period of relatively stagnant real incomes for these people at the bottom. Then the financial crisis, which was a colossal shock, and the subsequent very low productivity growth. Then what happens is, I think, the Republican Party first tries Romney. Romney doesn't work because Romney is in these themes. It doesn't work. The awful Obama wins. I don't think this is a choice. I think it's deliberate. Trump, however, is the way to solve this problem. And it basically means you shift it over from being predominantly dominated by the plutocrats to be predominantly dominated by the populists, but you still go for the low tax. Trump offered the low tax policy, not free trade, but low tax, all the rest of it. So it was sort of a compromise. The difficulty is you've got caught. The populist leader will ultimately take control of this party. That's what happened with Hitler. I'm not comparing Trump with Hitler, let's be clear. Just pointing out the political dynamic. And once this guy is in power, real power, your influence diminishes it very substantially. But you can still hope that in this new regime under Trump, the taxes will remain very low. You will be allowed to do what you like. The risk, of course, is the system becomes unstable and or extremely corrupt. And that isn't beneficial for most of the plutocrats. So it's maybe that making this marriage, which is the logical consequence of this progression, in my view, is not going to favor the plutocrats in the long run. But as you pointed out, a lot of the Nazi plutocrats did very, very, very well and came out of it with immense wealth. So it's not an unreasonable strategy. And it's one of the ways democracy ends.
Well, let's hope your book keeps democracy alive. And we both want to thank you tremendously for this really insightful interview. And keep at it, Martin. You're a really a major resource to the world. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Enormous pleasure. Really enormous. Thank you very much.